When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Aloe or Allbirds, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and great marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling, and for shoppers, buying, simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. Nobody does online business better than Shopify. It's home of Shop Pay, the #1 checkout in the world. You can use it to boost conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going through to checkout. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income to upgrade your selling today. That's shopify.com/income.
The Presidencies of the United States is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. Hello and welcome to the Presidencies of the United States. I'm your host, Jerry Landry. As this is part 2 of our Seat at the Table special series on the life and career of Alexander J. Dallas, I will be joined by 2 special guests, Cody and Stephen of the Imperfect Men podcast. If you haven't listened to Imperfect Men yet, I highly recommend, once you're done with this episode, finding it on your favorite podcast app of choice and checking it out. On their podcast, Stephen and Cody evaluate the careers and legacies of all the Founding Fathers, from Andrew Adams to George Wythe. From the obscure to the household names, they're looking at them all and helping us to understand the complex and flawed individuals who helped craft the founding documents of the United States. I'll share information on my social media about Imperfect Men around the release of these episodes, and I'll also have a link on the page for this episode on my website, presidenciespodcast.com. There, you can also find sources used for this episode, past episodes of the podcast, and all the ways that you, yes, you, dear listener, can help support the Presidencies podcast. Whether you give a monthly donation through Patreon, a one-time donation through Buy Me a Coffee, fulfill one of the requests on my research wish list, leave a rating and review, or just share information about the podcast with a history geek in your life, and yes, there's always at least one. I cannot thank you enough for all of your support. As always, questions or comments can be sent via email to presidenciespodcast@gmail.com. Or you can find me on Facebook, Mastodon, or Blue Sky as Presidencies, on the formerly known as Twitter at Presidencies89, and on Instagram and Threads as Presidencies Podcast. Without further ado, after this brief message, we'll pick up where we left off in part 1 of the life and career of Alexander J. Dallas.
Whoa, landing an account this big will totally change my landscaping business. It's going to mean hiring more guys and more equipment and new trucks for the new guys to drive the new equipment in. I don't know if I'm ready.
You can do this, and Ford Pro Simple can help. Our experts are ready to make growing pains less painful for your business with flexible financing solutions that meet the needs of your business today when you need them. Get started at fordpro.com/financing.
He did take an active role in Pennsylvania politics as the 1808 presidential election neared. He and the governor really worked, they were like, okay, Madison is the chosen candidate. Let's go ahead and get all Democratic Republicans in the state, radicals, we've had our problems in the past, come on board, let's do this. And so they were able to reach an agreement with the radicals. They were like, you know what, we will support Madison if you support our candidate, Simon Schneider, as the next governor. They finally agreed. Okay, it's done. And both Madison and Schneider won their respective races. And so at this point, he was still the U.S. District Attorney, and he considered resigning in December 1808. And, it's one of those times, okay, we've got an outgoing president, we've got a new president coming in, maybe I should resign. But then he was like, well, what if they appoint a radical? What if a radical gets this post? So he decided to remain. And ultimately, he would find himself more comfortable serving under the new president, for as Walters notes, quote, he, i.e. Dallas, approved generally of Madison's policies and the administration reciprocated his sentiments. Dallas would prove to be an early supporter in the push for war with Great Britain, and he got involved in the successful efforts to re-elect President Madison in 1812. But this didn't mean that he was in complete agreement with all that was going on in Madison's cabinet. In particular, Secretary of War John Armstrong, who we've covered previously in the series, would draw his ire, with Dallas writing that, quote, he, i.e. Armstrong, was the devil from the beginning, is now, and ever will be.
These guys are so dramatic with their like comparisons to stuff. There was another quote, I forget which one it was, but they were talking about how they're like the worst person in the whole world, and like they should be castrated or something like that. I was like, Jesus, why, man, this gets a little out of hand. I forget who it was, but
take it down a few notches, please.
Imagine these guys had social media back in the day. Oh, good Lord, they would have been awful.
Oh, God. That would have been the worst thing ever. Just like, but it would have been good burns and stuff, though. Like really old-timey burns.
That's true.
Which are pretty funny sometimes.
Yeah, that's what's missing from today's political discourse is some like quality burns. So now it's just like, oh, yeah, this small,
he's a loser.
Yeah, he's a loser.
Yeah. I said at one point a while back, I was like, I'm trying to imagine John Adams on social media. Oh my gosh.
Oh my God. He would just be the angriest person.
He'd be that commenter who has like 5 paragraphs in the comments about whatever the subject is.
He is someone who would go through and write every community note on like every possible post he could.
Yeah.
He's that.
Yes, he would. He would be that guy. But though Dallas wasn't really a fan of Armstrong, his relationship with Secretary of the Treasury Albert Gallatin continued to strengthen, and Gallatin increasingly turned to Dallas as a confidant in fiscal policy planning and as a go-between with prominent bankers in Philadelphia and state leaders whose favor Gallatin needed in order to support the war effort. So he's kind of acting as the person on the ground to be able to help the administration. And likewise, Gallatin's starting to bounce some ideas back and forth, float this idea by them. What do you think about this? So he's really starting to strengthen those ties. And Dallas would use his connections with leaders in Washington to intervene in matters related to prominent friends in Philadelphia, including merchant and banker Stephen Girard. So with the complications of the build-up to and then the prosecution of war with Britain in 1812, Girard turned to Dallas time and again to avoid being at cross purposes with the American government and to be given permission to pay ransoms to the British in order to get ships of his that they had captured back. So he's like, this war is really interfering with my merchant business, and can you pull some strings? Can we work this out?
That's like, just like I hate to say it, it sounds like standard politicking. It's like, well, you got a friend in high place. Well, maybe you can grease the wheels for me a little bit. Ugh.
Exactly. And I say this, and I try to bring this up in presidencies because this is nothing new. This was happening then as well. This wasn't necessarily this golden age of everybody had good intentions. They were in business just like folks are now.
I guess you could say they were imperfect men.
They were very imperfect men. But this would actually, there would be some benefit to the federal government, and kind of getting back to this idea of you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, because the federal government in the spring of 1813 was close to bankruptcy. At this point, and we talk about this more with some of the previous Treasury secretaries, the federal government was having a hard time financing this war. They couldn't even, they were issuing these Treasury notes and trying to bring in some funds, and it wasn't happening. The resources were drying up. And so Dallas becomes an integral part of this. He starts to facilitate this agreement with Girard, as well as David Parrish and John Jacob Astor, so two other prominent bankers and merchants. These three come to an agreement on April 6th to provide desperately needed funds to the U.S. government through a $16 million loan. And so Dallas is kind of the point person between the federal government and these bankers to make this happen. And at this point, the party fund is looking really good for Dallas, at least. He's got some funds because, as his biographer describes, quote, by 1814, the zealous application to the practice of law had earned him, i.e. Dallas, recognition as one of the ablest barristers in the United States and a private practice correspondingly lucrative. In 1801, his private practice had brought in $10,000 annually. By 1814, that number had climbed to over $20,000.
Zillion dollars today.
Yeah, that's a lot of money.
Yeah.
This is a lot of money. And it's interesting because it really didn't come from him charging like really large fees. It was rather that he took on, quote, a great number and variety of cases, many of such importance that he had to plead them before the state and federal courts in Philadelphia and the United States Supreme Court at Washington. So he's finally getting to that upper levels of judicial cases that really starts to bring in the money and the prestige. With his friend Gallatin away from day-to-day operations of the department, so at this point Gallatin had been sent on the Peace Commission to Europe, Dallas still continued to aid the Treasury Department through his contacts in Philadelphia banking circles. Now, as we discussed in his episode, Secretary of the Navy William Jones had his hands full running his own department as well as serving as the acting head of the Treasury. And so he was like, Dallas, help me out here. I've got to convince Madison. We need something happening. So Dallas was able to help him. They were starting to get things going, and Jones turns to the president. He's like, why don't you just make this guy the Treasury Secretary? Why don't you bring him into the cabinet? He's really been of benefit to us. And so on February 1st, 1814, Jones, as directed by the president, wrote to Dallas offering him either the post of Secretary of the Treasury or Attorney General. And so at this point, other prominent Pennsylvanians are saying, you really need to take up this Treasury position. It seems like you're doing a good job with that. You were able to help Gallatin. You know what's going on in Philadelphia. You're the right person for the job. But Dallas declines both offers. Now, going to the second one first, the post of Attorney General, as we've discussed in previous episodes, this was the lowest paid cabinet post. It only brought in $3,000 per year. This is a far cry from that, $20,000. But it would have meant, it was a part-time position. It would give him time for his private practice, but he'd still have to go to Washington for part of the year, and it would be for a small salary. So again, it's getting to, this would be a lot of work for not that much money. The Treasury position was full-time, so he could justify being in Washington more and not being able to do his private practice as much, but it only came with a salary of $5,000. And as Walters notes, quote, Dallas's mode of living in Philadelphia cost him more than 4 times that.
Jeez. It's the party. It's the party. He's still partying hard. Oh, my Lord.
He's too old to party.
Yeah, well, no, he's not. He'll die on the dance floor.
Going down dancing.
I find it interesting that it seems like he's offered both these positions, and yeah, he's involved with the banking, that sort of stuff. But it seems, I find it funny. It's like he is primarily a lawyer, and they want to put him in the Treasury Secretary job. It's like, do they really translate well?
Well, and it's interesting because it really comes to, at this point, what are really the qualifications for a Treasury Secretary? There are some folks who are involved in banking and in the merchant business, but there aren't that many. It's not that big of an industry at this point. And so you end up with people, even like Alexander Hamilton, technically he came from a legal background, but he was really good at this figuring out banking and finance. And it helped that he was in New York City, knew all of these movers and shakers. And so it becomes more about those connections and being able to convince them, okay, we need a new loan. We need you to help out. We need to figure out what's going on. And so that becomes more than necessarily having that specific background. There's also still so much legally that they're trying to figure out. And we'll get into some of that coming up. But, at this point, he says no. He's like, I don't really want either of these. And so Madison ultimately turned to George W. Campbell of Tennessee to fill the Treasury post, while a name that you brought up earlier, Richard Rush, was approached to become Attorney General. So this is when Rush comes into the cabinet. But Dallas continued to work with banker associates in Philadelphia to support new loan issues under Campbell. But unlike Gallatin, Campbell hesitated in agreeing to the terms of Astor and Parrish. He's more hesitant. And we talk more about that in his episode. But Dallas also got involved in efforts in 1814 to promote the creation of a new national bank to help stabilize the economic situation of the United States. So this was one of the problems, in 1811, the recharter of the National Bank had been voted down, but this was a tool that was needed in order to finance something like, say, a war with Britain. And so Dallas starts to coordinate efforts. He starts to talk with his friends Astor, Girard, Parrish, and they start putting together a plan for a new national bank. And Dallas volunteers his efforts to make arguments based on constitutional law and to lobby associates in Washington. But with hopes that peace was just around the corner, Dallas found that he was able to get little traction within the Madison administration in support of the bank proposal. Meanwhile, the economy was getting steadily worse. Then in, quote, August and early September, specie payment was suspended by every incorporated bank in the country except in New England. The Treasury was obliged to follow the same practice. So this was one of the things that comes up quite often at this point in American history. So you have these banknotes that are supposed to be redeemable in hard currency, so gold or silver, but they're saying we don't have enough gold or silver to pay out for the banknotes. And so instead of replenishing what remaining supplies they had, they said, we're just not going to redeem them. You're just going to have to hold on to the banknote.
Oh, that's a problem.
Yeah, that's it. Well, I mean, it's just like, how every so-called economic panic and as well as the Great Depression started, it was bank runs because everybody thought the banks were going to collapse. This is a time before, FDIC and all that sort of regulatory.
This is why why people have a distrust for banks even today.
Yeah,
because of stuff like this.
Yep.
Yeah. And so this is a serious problem. And without any kind of national bank to be able to help to guide policy or to be able to provide support, and the federal government doesn't have the money either. So it's like, this is the only way, but this is going to hurt the economy. This is saying the economy is really weak. And so these banknotes are going to start depreciating because folks aren't able to exchange them for hard specie. And so things are just getting worse and worse. And thus on September 8th, when Dallas received a letter from Astor with a new proposal for a national bank drafted after consultations with various New York financiers, he used it to draft a new bank plan to send Secretary of State Monroe for consideration. Now, as he was presenting this new idea for a bank, he had heard a rumor that Secretary Campbell was suffering from ill health and may have to step down from his post. So Dallas also included in this letter to Monroe, quote, a broad hint that he was now more receptive to an offer of a cabinet position than he had been in February. He also made sure he had been talking with Secretary Jones, and so he made sure to put a plug in there. And those rumors turned out to be true because Campbell resigned from his post on September 26th. This gets back to a point, Cody, that you made earlier. Dallas's biographer notes that, quote, Dallas had little experience in financial administration, but certain features of his record and character impressed the president. He had been one of the chief organizers of the Democratic-Republican Party in Pennsylvania and was now thoroughly devoted to the Madison administration and its war policy. He was highly regarded by the Democratic-Republican capitalists of the Middle States, who had found him a helpful ally in their as-yet unsuccessful campaign for a new national bank. Most important, Dallas manifested qualities of unselfishness and patriotism. So, thus, Madison, after ensuring that radical Democratic Republicans from Pennsylvania would not object to the nomination and receiving recommendations from bankers across the nation who, quote, expressed confidence that he, i.e. Dallas, could rescue the nation's credit from the morass into which it had sunk, offered Dallas the post at Treasury in early October and submitted his name to the Senate on October 5th. With no opposition, Dallas was confirmed, and he promptly left Philadelphia for Washington on October 11th. So now he is coming to office, and he is inheriting a mess.
Again, this is his specialty, the messes.
Yeah, he cleans up these. He's Mr. Clean, I guess.
Yeah.
He's a dancing Mr. Clean.
The dancing Mr. Clean. And he had to start with his own physical new desk because, as described by Walters, quote, during the last months of Campbell's secretaryship, the routine of the Treasury Department had come almost to a standstill. Unexamined papers were piled high on the office desk. As Dallas summarized it later, when he became secretary, the Treasury was suffering under every kind of embarrassment. So he had to literally clean off the desk.
The inbox was overflowing. It was just a pile, and it's just like, no.
And so he starts examining these. He starts going through the bills, and he's got to figure out they need money. But the only three sources of income that were available were the receipt of taxes, which was, quote, useless because they were paid chiefly in Treasury notes. So they're being paid back in the notes that they had issued. So that doesn't help.
We really know that, like, we of all people know these notes are useless. We can be paid in these.
Yeah, we're not taking those.
This is wacky. This is a wacky situation.
Yeah. Because the other source was bank credits from Southern and Western institutions, chiefly which had been, quote, rendered useless by the suspension of specie payment. So first they've got the source of their own notes, which they know are worthless. Then they've got the bank notes that they know are worthless. And then finally, the other source of income was, quote, the authority to borrow money when few people were willing to lend. So we can either accept useless notes, or we can beg for money.
I mean, they need, or start everybody turn over the couch cushions, check the lining of your carriages, see if there's any coins in there.
Exactly. Please help.
If you have party funds, now's the time. Please give.
And so this is an absolute mess. Luckily, he did find something potentially useful as he took office, a proposal from the House Ways and Means Committee Chairman, Representative John Wales Epps, Democratic Republican from Virginia. As a staunch opponent to the idea of a new national bank, Epps realized that he had to offer up something else to come to the relief of the federal government. Thus, he, in consultation with his father-in-law, some nobody named Thomas Jefferson, put together a plan which made its way through the committee on October 10th for, quote, the issuance of interest-bearing Treasury notes in sums sufficiently small for the ordinary purposes of society. So basically this plan was, if we can't get money from these large notes because the bankers, the folks with a lot of money aren't willing to give us anything, let's issue these smaller notes and maybe we can get more folks to invest and provide funds to the federal government. But after being in office only 4 days, on October 17th, Dallas presented a full program to the relief of the nation's finances, which, quote, was almost completely at variance with Epps' plan. So he looked at this plan and he was like, let's do the exact opposite. Because even though, Epps and Dallas agreed that taxes should be increased on things like carriages, auction sales, liquor, postage, things like that, Dallas felt that the small treasury notes would be, quote, an expensive and precarious substitute either for coin or for banknotes. And so instead, he proposed, you guessed it, a new national bank, arguing that, quote, the establishment of a national institution operating upon credit combined with capital and regulated by prudence and good faith was the only efficient remedy for the disordered condition of our circulating medium. He's like, look, there is no other option. This is what we have to do.
And it seems like there were so many times over the years various people tried to kill a sort of national bank, and I think it was finally by the fourth or fifth time it got proposed, which is essentially the Federal Reserve. It's like, okay, look, we've learned we need to just have one of these things.
Yeah. And so Dallas is definitely in that camp. He's saying, look, this just needs to happen. I've talked with the experts. I've talked with the finance folks in Philadelphia. This needs to happen. And so he drew up his proposal for a bank with a 30-year charter, which would be headquartered in Philadelphia, but with the option of opening offices in various other American cities. The bank that he proposed would start with $50 million in capital, $20 million of which, quote, was to be subscribed by the government, and the rest by individuals and corporations, 1/10 of which at least had to, quote, be paid for in specie, the rest in government stock and treasury notes issued during the war. So he's trying to balance things. He's trying to say, we need federal involvement. We need the federal government involved, but we also need individual partners. We need partners from outside of the government, and we need a diverse form of capital here. And this bank would also be empowered, quote, to make reasonable loans to the United States if required by an act of Congress. As noted by Walters, quote, in these provisions, the new secretary showed that he desired a national bank not to restore specie payments immediately, but to enable the Treasury to obtain funds necessary to continue the war. So he's like, first of all, we need to get done with this war. Then we can work out what's going on with the specie crisis. While Dallas wrote to Epps that he realized the national bank proposal would face opposition on constitutional grounds, he argued that, quote, the establishment of a national bank will not only be useful in promoting the general welfare, but is necessary and proper for carrying into execution some of the important powers constitutionally vested in the government. And he actually personally testified before the House Ways and Means Committee, as well as the Senate Committee, considering the issue of a national bank to lobby for his proposal. So he was going all out. He also got his friends involved. He got Astor and Parrish to travel down to Washington to meet with congressional members. It's not just me putting this forward. These are successful bankers. Listen to them. On November 7th, 1814, the House Ways and Means Committee reported out, quote, a bank bill along substantially the same lines Dallas had proposed. So things are looking good. We've actually got it out of committee. But then opposition starts to build with somebody you mentioned at the beginning. Representative John C. Calhoun of South Carolina decides to put forward an alternate plan for a bank, which was designed to appeal to Federalists as well as supporters of Representative Epps.
Calhoun in his volcano lair.
He is developing this plan in his volcano lair. And so this plan proves popular. Calhoun included what he knew to get various folks on board, but Secretary Dallas wrote a letter arguing that Calhoun's alternate plan was, quote, impractical and dangerous. And he insisted, he's like, look, we don't have any time. We are nearly out of funds. We need to do the national bank like I proposed now. And around this time, even though he was still relatively new to the office, a rumor started circulating that Dallas was considering resigning. And you have in a business paper from Baltimore, the Niles Register, this, as they're talking about this, they write, quote, we hope not, that they hope that he's not considering resigning because, quote, he, i.e. Dallas, seems just such a man as the people want. This is a guy who has confidence from people who are outside of Washington. We need him in office. Now, the Senate in early December put forward a bill for a new national bank along the lines of the Dallas proposal. Within a week, it was passed and sent on to the House. Unfortunately, the House shelved the bill. And this time, Representative Daniel Webster, Federalist from New Hampshire, put forward his own alternative national bank plan, which passed on January 7th, 1815, by a vote of 120 to 38.
A pretty definitive statement of, oh, yeah, we like this one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is this the same Daniel Webster who will kind of become like Secretary of State and run for president or whatever?
Same Daniel Webster. So it's interesting. That's the time that you really start to see Clay, Calhoun, Webster. You start to see them really rising to prominence.
Yeah.
And so he's put forward this bill, yet puts forward a national bank. It's not really what Dallas wanted, but the Senate's like, well, it's a national bank, right? One's better than nothing. So they pass Webster's bill. The main point of difference between this bill and Dallas's was that, unlike Dallas's plan, the national bank would be unable to suspend specie payments, which would put it at a disadvantage to every other bank that could. And the government would have no say-so at all over the bank's board of directors. The bank in Webster's proposal also could not lend more than $500,000 to the federal government. So it's at a disadvantage to other banks. The federal government really doesn't have any control over it, and there's a limit to how much money they can loan the federal government. So all of this, Dallas looks at this and he's like, this is ridiculous. This is not going to work. And so he advises the president to veto the bill, which Madison promptly did on January 30th. And again, at this time, rumors start to circulate that Dallas was considering resigning. And indeed, he was struggling to keep the federal government afloat while Congress continued its debate. On January 17th, 1815, Dallas sent the House Ways and Means Committee a report on stopgap measures to keep the government funded until Congress took action on the national bank proposal. And this was a very somber report. This is, things are really bad. We are nearly broke.
This sounds familiar.
Yeah, exactly.
Stopgap measures to keep the government funded.
Could we just keep it funded for a few more days and avoid a shutdown? But they actually, unlike some Congresses that we've seen more recently, they were like, okay, we're actually going to listen to you. We understand. We got the message. They quickly passed his proposed measures. Now, as if trying to get the Treasury stabilized and lobbying for a national bank wasn't enough on his plate, Dallas also worked in November and December of 1814 on a paper to explain, quote, the war policy of the Madison administration. This work, titled, quote, an exposition of the causes and character of the late war with Great Britain, was, at the request of President Madison, quote, adopted by the cabinet and circulated as an official act of the government. So this is a rah-rah, this is why we're doing this. We promise there's a reason to this war.
Shouldn't, the Secretary of, War be writing that?
No.
You would think. But no, Dallas gets charged with this one too, which that also was a mess. But thankfully for all involved, it wouldn't be long before the administration would no longer have a need to justify its war aims. Because Dallas, along with Secretary of the Navy Benjamin Crowninshield, President pro tempore of the Senate John Galliard of South Carolina, and Representative John C. Calhoun were at a dinner being hosted by the French minister to the U.S., Louis Solier, on the evening of February 13th, 1815, when a messenger arrived informing one of the attendees of the peace treaty achieved with Britain at Ghent. The war was over. And so they were already at a party. You can imagine it went even bigger and probably lasted all night and into the next day.
Pool all of the party funds together and let's just have one big party.
It's party time. Now, of course, this was great news. Okay, the war is over. We can finally start to demobilize. We can get things back in order. But there is still the problem of the nation's finances. And Dallas realized they weren't out of the woods. They'd need to plan a transition to a peacetime setting and start settling some of the debts incurred during the war. While he was also thinking of his own office, Dallas was being called on to provide support on an unofficial basis at the State Department, as Secretary Monroe's health had suffered with his exertions during the war, and he was away from the capital for extended periods to recover. And this is something we had talked about with Monroe's episodes. Dallas was also made acting Secretary of War during the 9 months between William H. Crawford's nomination to the post and his return to the U.S. to assume the role. So Crawford was actually in France at the time. He was on his way back, but you had 9 months where we need somebody in charge of the War Department. And this meant that Dallas would be in part responsible for, quote, paying the large army which had fought in the recent war. He came into the role to find that, quote, the strained condition of governmental finances and the inept administration of the War Department under Secretaries Armstrong and Monroe had created an arrearage that exceeded $1.8 million by the close of 1814. Many officers had not been paid since October 1814.
Ooh, goodness great. Well, again, government has problems with its money. Well, the soldiers are essential employees.
Yes. And especially since they're about to be demobilized, you don't want them to necessarily be upset with you. You want them to leave on good terms. So maybe we need to figure out how to pay them.
Yeah, seeing how they're, our defense and they know how to kill you.
Yes. Let's go ahead and work on that plan. Now, it did help that, as he's acting head of the War Department, he's also the Treasury Secretary. So if anybody can find where funds are, it's the Treasury Secretary. And so he starts reallocating funds. And at this time, New York and Pennsylvania had kicked in some funds to support the citizens of their respective states that had served in the militia during the war. So they're kicking in some funds. Okay, let's throw this into the pot. And Dallas drew on because, of course, he's got no military background. So he calls on 6 generals to act as an advisory board to help make plans for the process of demobilizing the army and taking it back into a peacetime status. And so the board helped Dallas starting in early April in drafting a comprehensive plan by May 1st, 1815. And by mid-month, they had the president's blessing to carry it out. Now, of course, there were critics of the demobilization plan, including these officers who were being disbanded. They were losing their salaries. They'd have to figure out what was next for them. They weren't really too happy about this. Dallas would also have to work to facilitate the handover from the British of Forts Mackinac and Niagara back to the U.S., so these men captured during the war, and to exclude British trading companies from dealing with native peoples in the Northwest. In addition, he worked to carry out a plan devised by Monroe to establish, quote, a string of garrisons in strategic positions in the Northwest from Green Bay to Chicago to combat the remaining native threat in the area, as well as, quote, another series of posts from Chicago along the Illinois River to St. Louis to cultivate and civilize the southwestern border area. Dallas also had the unenviable task of trying to rein in Andrew Jackson.
That is a full-time job unto itself. Like, he will literally shoot you if you try to do it.
Yes. Thankfully, he wasn't in Washington, D.C. at the time. He was in New Orleans, but Jackson had maintained a state of martial law for several months after the threat had passed in New Orleans. You know, this was really severe management, and Dallas is the one who was charged with telling him, you know what, you need to back off. It's fine, really. Let go of some of the power. And so during his first year in office, Dallas lodged at a boarding house owned by Mrs. Wilson, where his wife Maria joined him at times for extended stay. But in the winter of 1815 and 1816, they opted to rent a house that their children, George, Matilda, and Trevanion, could join them as well. There's that last one again.
Snake Lord. Yep. He's back.
The Snake Lord. And this house was described as being, quote, done up in elegant style, and they have it well furnished. The ballroom is converted into wards for their servants. But this was a place where the who's who of Washington society gathered. And one senator proclaimed that, quote, Dallas's scene beats the drawing room of Mrs. Madison greatly.
So he gives better parties than the First Lady does.
Well, oh yeah, of course. He's the party man.
He's the Secretary of Party.
He is officially the Secretary of Partying. Not surprisingly, during the summer of 1815, given all the work that he had to do with the Treasury, War, and State Departments, Dallas suffered 2 attacks of quote-unquote excruciating pains, which, you know, I'd mentioned earlier, this recurring bout of health issues.
Sounds like it's the stress of all this. Like, it's probably just all the strain of just having all these responsibilities. He's probably just, his body's just giving up on him. His brain is just shutting down.
Yeah. But he did recover, but just kind of keep that in mind. Turning back to his work with the Treasury Department, without a national bank, Dallas realized that the federal government's relations with other banks was critical, and thus, quote, instead of suing banks which failed to pay specie on their obligations to the government, as they were legally obliged to do, Secretary Dallas proposed that they and the specie-paying banks join in forming an association which would help the Treasury Department conduct its fiscal operations. So he's like, you know what? None of us are really doing well. Let's figure out a plan together. And the advantage to the banks in this association was that, quote, they were to be the official depositories for the government. So the government would deposit what funds they had in these banks that they partnered with. And so he sent out a circular letter to 21 banks from across the nation. Unfortunately, there was little interest in this plan. And so by late April, he abandoned this scheme. But he had other options. He wasn't just playing one card. He was trying to figure out what could work here. And so he let the House Ways and Means Committee know in late February that he wanted to work towards, quote, the retirement of the Treasury notes issued during wartime, and they obliged by pushing through Congress a loan bill that would help to facilitate the return of Treasury notes to the Treasury in order to take up subscription in the loan stock and thus remove those notes from circulation. So it's like, let's just go ahead and bring those in. We'll issue new notes, but let's get those out. Unfortunately, despite his hopes that he could use this to navigate the federal deficit in a beneficial way for the national government with bankers, he thought that they may give him a better deal for this new loan stock than had been the case with the earlier notes. This failed to materialize, and thus he abandoned this plan as well. So plan number 2 is out. So his backup option, he turned to state banks, quote, to acquire a supply of state banknotes for use in the districts where those notes circulated, And he was able to get some of the better deals from them than he had originally hoped. So this is starting to work. He's like, okay, state banks are having problems as well. We'll go ahead and take those notes off of you. We'll go ahead and use those, but we'll have them in use in that district. And by mid-May, Dallas was able to inform President Madison that he had enough, quote, local paper for the local operations of the Treasury. Then on June 15th, he announced, quote, that funds were available to retire in the near future certain of the wartime Treasury notes at Philadelphia, Savannah, Washington, and Baltimore. So he was starting to break it down by district, and let's go ahead and try and get things in place in these places. Unfortunately, the rosy picture that Dallas was painting neglected to mention that, quote, the Treasury still had insufficient funds for operations at New York and Boston. It had become loaded with $6 million worth of the bank paper of Washington, Baltimore, and Philadelphia, worth about 60 cents on a specie dollar. And only about $3 million of the Treasury notes had been retired from circulation. So it was starting to have a little effect, but just not enough, and there were still problems. It also neglected to mention that in the New York banks that had jealously guarded its specie during the war, the Treasury had been taking the tact of, quote, settling claims in whatever medium it had available. And that could be Treasury notes, that could be the notes of distant banks, and all of these were depreciated notes. They were less in value than on paper. And so, quote, this naturally aroused resentment among New England bankers who felt that they were being penalized for holding to the specie standard. So they were like, we did what we were supposed to do. Why are we being punished for this?
Was there any discussion around this time of just, I don't know, raising taxes to pay for this stuff?
And that was the thing. So that was part of the conversation, but the problem was, what were you going to be paid with? Because with specie not being as readily available and the banks not paying out in specie, you would get banknotes that were less than the value that they were supposed to be in specie. So you could get notes, but it really wasn't worth the face value.
Sort of a catch-22 situation.
Yeah, it was really this circular problem that was happening, and he couldn't get everybody on board to figure out a plan, nor could he get them to actually pass a national bank bill in order to have some tool that the federal government could use to help stabilize the situation. And so this increasingly became Dallas's focus. And on June 15th, 1815, quote, he announced that on and after August 1st, revenue collectors would refuse to accept banknotes not redeemable in gold or silver. So if we can't exchange these for specie, we're not taking them. Now, this brought opposition from some of the banks who were not on the specie standard. And as this opposition increased, Dallas started extending the starting date. He was like, okay, well, maybe August 1st is, too soon. We'll put it back to October 1st. But as that date neared, quote, it had become clear that this plan too had small chance of success. So he goes back to the drawing board. He sends another circular letter to bank presidents on October 12th about a new idea. Quote, banks were to agree that if they should refuse to pay specie on their own notes or on money deposited with them, they would pay 6% interest a year on the sum in question, commencing on the day of refusal. So he's like, okay, I understand you can't pay in specie now, but go ahead and add on some interest whenever you ultimately do pay it out. They didn't like that idea. So back to the drawing board yet again. Plan C, D, E, F, whatever we're on now. And by the time of his report on December 6, 1815, Dallas had come to the conclusion, quote, that gold and silver were not necessarily indispensable for a national currency. So this is decades before the idea of the greenback, which is a national paper currency, as viable fiscal policy, but Dallas is starting to suggest just that.
It's interesting.
he's starting to suggest maybe we need a national currency instead of relying on state banks and private banks and their notes. Maybe we need a national currency that we can control as the solution to this issue.
Yeah, especially like looking at it nowadays, it's like, okay, gold and silver aren't necessarily important to uh, the value of the currency. It's just its value is whatever we say it is. And seeing that kind of seed here, it's a lot earlier than I thought it was.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. Now, this sounds like a good plan, but he warns 3 goals had to be met in order to ensure national financial stability. 1, the federal government, quote, must almost triple its income. So even if we put this in place, we've got to bring in more revenue. 2, the national bank had to be reestablished. And 3, specie payments had to be resumed by both the federal government and the banks. This is the only way all of this is going to work. And so 2 months after this report was issued, Dallas began pressing on the first point by lobbying for a protective tariff in a report on February 12th, 1816. And so this is really where it comes to, during the war, raising internal taxes didn't really work because you really couldn't get any specie. But now trade is opened back up, and especially trade with Britain. So let's go ahead and put higher tariffs in place. This will bring in specie. This will bring in revenue from outside of the U.S. to help start to replenish our supply of specie. And this was interesting because he shared the results gathered from a call for, quote, suggestions about tariff rates that he had issued to the business and merchant industry a few months prior. They were like, this is a great idea. This will really help. It'll also help our industries to rebound. We're not just bringing in new specie and new revenue. We're also helping to support industries that are still trying to compete, but Britain, France, they're so much further along than us. This will be a protective tariff. And by April, quote, Secretary Dallas succeeded in getting Congress to commit itself for the first time in American history to the principle of protection. But after fighting this, there was that second thing. He had to get the national bank. He had to bring this back up. This time, he had an unexpected ally. Representative John C. Calhoun had a change of heart. And as the chairman of the House Committee on Currency, he was well positioned to help guide Dallas's proposal through. So he's finally on board with this.
Which is saying something, because getting Calhoun to change his mind, that's no small feat.
No. They also had the support of the Speaker of the House, Henry Clay. And so these are some big names. They're starting to be able to bring folks on board. There was opposition still, but in the end, the bank supporters would win out. And so on April 10th, 1816, the bill establishing a new bank became law. Congress also passed a law that would require, quote, all revenue to be paid in specie or its equivalent after February 20th, 1817. And Dallas followed up that summer with a message to the state banks that this requirement would be enforced by the Treasury Department and urged them to work towards the resumption of specie payments by October 1st. So they're starting to say, okay, time is up. We're resuming this. We are being paid in specie. The bankers were kind of concerned. They were like, we don't know if we can really make this February deadline. And they countered with an offer to resume specie payments by the first Monday of July, 1817. Dallas thought about this, and he refused to consider this. President Madison was kind of reluctant. He was like, well, maybe we do need to consider. Maybe we can push it out to July. Finally, Dallas convinced him. He was like, we just need to stand our ground here. And so ultimately, his efforts would come to fruition as the new Bank of the United States opened on January 1st, 1817. And on February 20th, 1817, specie payments were resumed by every U.S. bank.
At long last.
At long last, the 3 parts of this are finally in place. The nation's finances can start to recover. But by this point, Dallas had actually moved on from the Treasury Department when this actually happened, when this goal was finally succeeded. So maintaining 3 households was a major financial strain. So he had 2 houses in Pennsylvania, he had 1 in Washington, and his personal expenses, as you can imagine, eclipsed his $5,000 annual salary as Treasury Secretary. So as early as February 1816, Dallas began writing about his anticipation at returning to life as a private citizen. In April of that year, knowing that the National Bank and the tariffs were in place, he announced his intention to retire. In his resignation letter to Madison of April 8th, Dallas offered to stay on until October so that he could help to guide the establishment of the bank, to which the president readily agreed. He also recommended his cabinet colleague William H. Crawford as his successor and even worked to convince Crawford to accept the post if he was offered it. And so he's starting to get his exit strategy in place. In early May, Dallas and his family returned to Philadelphia to figure out his next steps. So kind of got a plan in place for the Treasury. We need to figure out a plan as a family. He would suffer again from a painful attack without any warning. We've discussed this earlier. Though he would recover from it, still need to keep that in mind. Meanwhile, a group of congressmen from Kentucky approached Dallas about the idea of putting his name forward as a candidate for president that year. But Dallas declined. He was in firm support of Monroe's candidacy. In September, Democratic Republicans in Philadelphia began organizing a campaign to elect Dallas to Congress. But Dallas turned this down as well. He's like, no, really, I need to go into retirement. That same month, Dallas made his way back to Washington to wrap up his public business there. But as Madison had still not made up his final decision on who should be offered the post, I know you say Crawford's good, but I'm still having a bit of a think here. Dallas agreed to remain as Treasury Secretary, but he's like, your time's about up. You need to figure this out. Crawford ended up being his successor, and so on October 20th, 1816, Dallas was able to officially hand over the post. And as you've kind of seen, he entered this post 2 years prior. Everything was on fire. It was a mess. He's leaving it, and it's in a much stronger fiscal situation for the government. For the fiscal year ending September 30th, the intakes from customs had been $36 million, which was $15 million more than Dallas anticipated. So it was even greater than his projections. And he predicted a surplus of $20 million by the end of the calendar year. So he was leaving things going in the right direction.
That's a pretty good job then.
Yeah.
Yeah. And up and down the Eastern Seaboard, papers were filled with praise for Dallas and his tenure as Treasury Secretary. And in his annual message to Congress that year, President Madison also poignantly recognized Dallas's efforts to reestablish, quote, the solid foundation on which the financial prosperity of the nation rests. And his biographer Walters summed up his tenure at Treasury as follows, quote, Dallas accomplished results that rank him as one of the ablest of the early secretaries of the Treasury. Through charmingly written reports and persuasive personal solicitation, he put into effect a bold, far-reaching program, attaining success in spite of a recalcitrant banking community, a vacillating president, and a shilly-shallying Congress. And yes, I had to include the shilly-shallying.
Yeah, I like that a lot.
I'm going to use that.
Was it shilly-shally?
Yeah, I'm going to use
Shilly-shallying.
Oh, yeah.
And, quote, his program represented the new objectives of the Democratic Republicans of the commercial northern and middle states, as contrasted with the agrarian Jeffersonianism of the South. So, job well done.
Yeah.
Though he left official office, Dallas was still called on by President Madison to provide support, including drafting, quote, 3 paragraphs on the government receipts and expenditures for 1816, which Madison utilized almost verbatim in his annual message to Congress in December. Now, at this point, the Dallas children had mostly grown up and left home, so there was only the 18-year-old Matilda and the nearly 16-year-old Trevanion remaining in the household when they went back to Philadelphia. The snake guy is still around.
Snake Lord. He's a lord.
The Snake Lord. And Dallas, of course, returned to the active practice of law and became involved in cases in the federal courts in Philadelphia, as well as cases before the state Supreme Court. However, while in Trenton, New Jersey for a case in early January 1817, Dallas again suffered from a bout of intense pain. As described by Walters, quote, "For 6 nights he could not sleep, tortured by pain and worry over the outcome of the trial. Despite his pain, he continued to attend the court proceedings until the judgment was handed down. He attempted to return to Philadelphia by stagecoach, but suffered another attack and got off at a place in New Jersey where he summoned his own coach to bring him back home. He arrived at his home on the afternoon of January 15th and went straight to bed. Doctors were summoned, and his sons George and Trevanion held vigil over him. However, around 2 o'clock in the morning on January 16th, 1817, Alexander James Dallas passed away at the age of 57. His death was mourned by friends and political adversaries in Philadelphia, and all of the courts in the city, quote, adjourned in his memory. The U.S. Supreme Court agreed, quote, to wear crape on their left arms during the February term in Dallas's honor. His funeral was held on January 18th, and though Philadelphia was facing 17-degree temperatures that afternoon, it was described as, quote, the largest crowd in Philadelphia since the death of Dr. Benjamin Rush 4 years before. After a service at the Dallas home, a procession took the body to St. Peter's Church, where his remains were interred at the church's burial yard. Dallas's biographer, Raymond Walters Jr., summed up his legacy as follows, quote, because of his versatility, energy, devotion, winning personality, and uncommonly high ability, Dallas was able to do so much for his country during a relatively short lifetime that he holds a secure place as one of the first-rate men of secondary rank in the early days of the American Republic. Now, we mentioned towards the beginning that, this wasn't the end of the family's political legacy and in this legacy of public service. So his son and namesake, Alexander James Dallas, following his service in the War of 1812 and the Second Barbary War, would go on to establish and command the Pensacola Navy Yard from 1832 to 1843 and served in the Second Seminole War. And he passed away in 1844 at the age of 53. So the Snake Lord Trevanion would follow his father into the law. He served as a judge of the Court of Common Pleas for Allegheny County from 1835 to 1839, when he became an associate judge for the District Court of Allegheny County, a post that he held until his death in 1841 at the age of 40.
Didn't set up his Horcruxes in time.
His daughter Matilda's husband, William Wilkins, would eventually serve as the U.S. District Court Judge for Pennsylvania's Western District from 1824 to 1831 before being elected as a U.S. Senator, which he served until 1834 when he accepted an appointment as U.S. Minister to Russia. And he would assume office in 1843 as a U.S. Representative, but would only serve for a year before accepting an appointment as Secretary of War in the Tyler administration. So he now has a son-in-law who is also joining the cabinet.
Nice.
That will eventually be getting an episode.
So he will be getting an episode, and so we will be talking about an extended member of this family. We'll also be talking about, you mentioned his son, George Mifflin, who would go on to be vice president under President James K. Polk. We'll talk about him more with our vice presidency series. But with that, we are at the end of the life and career of Alexander Dallas. So before we go into our ranking categories, what are your first thoughts?
How have I not really known too much about this man before? Because it seems like very crucial to really saving the nation's economy during a really rough patch.
Yeah. And my first thoughts are, how did Cody not know about this guy before? No, yeah, this guy was...
Especially like the cabinet during the War of 1812. It's like the ones you hear about are James Monroe because he was state and war at the same time, and that doesn't happen too often. And then John Armstrong because he was so horribly incompetent at the job. Those are the two that you kind of hear about more.
Yeah. This guy, he kind of went under the radar, like as far as like, and he shouldn't have.
No,
he like single-handedly, basically got everything the way it works now together. So it's like, how do we not know about this guy?
An unsung hero.
Exactly. And so we'll focus in on his time in the cabinet in a minute, but let's start with our whole picture round, which this round looks at the overall career and character of the cabinet member. And so we can each award up to 10 points total, and we'll take the totals from you two and divide by 2. So what are you thinking about just his overall life and career?
You go first.
You can go ahead.
Yeah, it seems like he was not necessarily like at the forefront of the political machinations, at least the public ones, but it seems like he's kind of one of these behind the scenes types who is kind of like using his influence, using his office a little bit to kind of push things in certain directions. Like you said, like combating the radical faction of his party, trying to be like, okay, let's be a little more moderate. Let's kind of take things back a step. Let's not go full bore into radical policies, or take a more measured approach. And it seems like, especially in, this term works for him, he was kind of dancing around the cabinet positions for a while before actually joining the cabinet. Kind of like almost like one of these unofficial advisors, kind of pushing things along. So it seemed like, that was really like kind of his influence. It wasn't like flashy. It was more like behind the scenes and measured.
Yeah, I think his ability to be humble is something for me that's very important, especially in somebody that in that kind of position where he could be like, okay, I'm going to step back because I don't need to do this thing. I just wanted to make sure whoever was doing it before was doing it right. And now I'm going to step back because now it's done right. He didn't crave power. And I think that's rare in humans in general. That's why I have a high esteem for like George Washington and stuff, because he could have been king, right? Like they wanted him to be king.
Yeah.
And he could have been if he wanted, but he was like, no, that's not what we fought for. We fought it against the king. We don't need another one. He could have easily done that. A lesser man probably would have. And this guy seems like he's of the same ilk. So yeah, I think he's a really honorable type dude. So,
and he turned down cabinet positions, like 2 of them that were offered to him initially. They put his name forward for president. He's like, no, I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
So it's like he sees a problem and wants to fix it.
Yeah.
If problem is fixed, he does not need to be there.
Exactly. I mean, and that's the thing. And that, I think that's a key part of this. It wasn't just that he had to deal with a mess. We've seen, and especially with the Madison cabinet, we've seen so many people who have come into office and inherited a mess, and they leave it a mess, or even worse than it was when they arrived. But in every office that he gets into, going back to, his Secretary of the Commonwealth position, here he comes in, this is a new position. Nobody really knows what he's supposed to be doing. And he's like, okay, well, the governor obviously can't handle things, so I'm just going to do it. And he builds in his prestige and constantly builds in his prestige. More and more people get to know him, and they're like, this is the guy. If you've got a tough job, this is who you want. And so it brings him to the national level. We've seen so many instances of folks who just kind of fall into a position because they know so-and-so or they're associated with this family, but he really earned these positions. And so what are y'all thinking out of a possible 10 points?
I'm thinking an 8 because it's very impressive. You don't really see too many instances of him messing up. Let's say, like, it just chugging along doing his job and doing other people's job because they're terrible at it and he just needs to fix it, which I sympathize with because I do that a lot in my job. It's like I see something messed up. It's like, all right, just you go do something. Somebody fix it. I'll fix it. It'll be done right. So I can empathize with that. So I'm gonna say an 8.
I'm gonna give him a 9. Almost perfect score.
Nice.
Because again, like, it's a rare breed that is somebody in his position that can step back, so and then you just don't see it often. So
yeah. This one is definitely, it's got to be a high score because he not only, we've had folks who have had good careers, but just what he was able to achieve and some of the things, the fact that he worked to codify laws, to actually publish, judicial opinions and rulings, and was the first Supreme Court recorder. And it wasn't that was even an office that somebody appointed him to. He just started doing it because it needed doing. This is a guy who, it's not a regular sort of ambition. He's not necessarily ambitious for office. He's ambitious for purpose. He sees something that needs doing and he signs up for it. And so that is so admirable. I just, this has got to be successful. Could he have gone further? Could he have achieved more? Possibly, if he had been a little more ambitious, but that was also some of his strength, was that he wasn't ambitious for office. I think I'm going to go middle of the road between y'all. I'm going to give him an 8.5, which means that he starts out with a 17 in this category. But now let's focus in on that cabinet time. Let's go into our go-getter round. This round looks at the impact of the cabinet member during their time in the cabinet. And again, we can each award up to 10 points maximum.
I mean, it's Mr. Fix-It. I mean, he came into a horrible situation during a war, which, say what about the War of 1812, it wasn't really a war we won or a war we lost, but it was just a pointless conflict in the end of it. But coming in the middle of this, the country's finances are a crap show, and he just comes in, he develops this plan, he just keeps going, okay, well, this isn't going to work, okay, well, this doesn't work, okay, I think we can do this, I'm going to use my contacts to kind of help out here, I know a guy, he'll help us out, just trying to just exhausting all these plans when other people were just not great at it, and coming in and in the end resolving the issue, and he sees through this program that really saves the country's economic or fiscal what's the word I'm looking for, saves the country's fiscal framework, I guess you could say, and also provides the seeds for like some future policies, like you mentioned, greenbacks. Those are, that's really essentially the money we have today. And really, it's kind of sad he dies right before that last little bit goes through. I'm gonna say a 9.
Well, yeah, I'd agree with all that, and I'd also say he established the national bank. I feel like that's like a reestablished. But it
would also go away under Andrew Jackson again.
So well, I'm just saying, that's kind of a huge. It's kind of a big thing, and he took essentially a mess and made it into something like a lesser man couldn't do that. Like the guy before him couldn't do that. So I don't know. It's hard for me not just to say a 10. I'm gonna say 10.
That's why I go for it.
It was a lot. It was a lot, and it was a lot of good stuff. I'm giving it 10.
And on top of it, it's he helped out with all the other departments.
Exactly. Yeah, he had all the other departments, 3 other departments at one point.
I'm reminded of, I think it was during Harding's or Coolidge's presidency. Like Herbert Hoover, who was the Commerce Secretary, had his hands in everything, to the point where he was just called the Secretary of Everything. And I'm kind of getting shades of that from this guy.
Exactly. I mean, and that's the thing, like he was running 3 of the 4 departments at one point. And I mean, 3 really important, diverse, large departments. And, you know, it's just, this is, again, it's high. He is got to make high points here just because he came in and there was nothing. I mean, the Treasury was nearly bankrupt and there was no plan in place to be able to avoid bankruptcy for the federal government. He turned it around. He figured out what his agenda was. He pushed it. He actually got stuff through Congress. How many people can say that?
Not many.
He got Congress to do something.
We can't even do that now.
So this is, yeah, you can't do that nowadays. I am like Steve. I'm tempted for a 10. I think I will leave a little room.
I don't know, like how, like who could do more and get a better score. Like I don't know. I don't have any reference to that, but it seems like he did a lot, and it was. I'm not trying to influence your score, but I am a little bit.
I think I'm going to leave a little room just for the scope, because the government is still, compared to, you know, the 20th and 21st century, it's still minuscule. There's still not as much as there grows to be. So I'm going to leave a little room. I'll go with a 9.5, but this one is very tempting to make a 10. And so this gets him, he is now at 36 points. We have had so many cabinet members in the Madison administration. Let's see, let me look and see. We have only had one of the, at this point, 11 other members of the Madison cabinet. Only one has scored 36 points total. And this is after 2 rounds.
Yeah.
But our third round may change that, because this is our hot seat round. This round discusses any disgraceful behavior of or actions committed by the cabinet member. And this disgrace does not have to be during their tenure of office in the cabinet. And we can take away up to 10 points each.
So you mentioned slavery earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Did he? Because I don't remember exactly. Did he actually own slaves?
So his wife inherited enslaved individuals from her father, and then so he was managing that estate, and they opted to sell them in order to get money to travel to Philadelphia.
Okay, that's right. Yeah, that's not great. Basically, selling people for your travel plans.
Yeah,
that's not great.
That is not great.
Yeah.
And I don't know if we want to add into the mix here that his wife was 16 when they married.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Ew. Which, I guess it was more common back then, but that's still kind of cringy.
How long did they stay together? Did they stay together their whole lives or whatever?
They were together for his whole life.
Okay.
She was widowed. Yeah.
Yeah, other than that, it doesn't seem like he was that scandalous. Does this seem like he was so focused on his job? Or like whatever responsibility he had? There could be some things with, like, you know, especially earlier on when he was holding all these offices, like there may have been some conflicts of interest between them. especially there was that what was it? He was holding federal offices in like a state office, and they tried to get him out of the state office. I don't know if that was his scandal.
And then he also nearly got into the duel with the guy with the freeze case.
Yeah, that's not a great look. Maybe he was just so stressed out by that point. I'm going to say I'll say a 3 for the duel, marrying a 16-year-old, and the involvement with slavery. So
yeah, I'm gonna match him on a 3 on that, because the slavery thing, like that was his wife's inheritance. Yeah, he was dealing with the estate, but I don't know. It's like a degree of separation there.
Yeah,
and also like it's not good no matter how you look. It's still a bad thing. It's just I don't know. That's a hard one. I'm gonna say a 3, 2.
Yeah, and that's the thing, there's with the slavery issue, there's no quantification that can really meet the horror and the barbarity of it. And even though they weren't engaged in it for that long, the fact that they did benefit from slavery is something that we do have to take into account. But overall, and I don't want to take too many points from him, because I think overall, and especially in scope, and you think about people, and especially some folks who are coming up, Calhoun, there are really some bad people coming up.
Oh, he's going to get a 10.
Yeah. So I think I'm going to just take away 2 points from him, which means that for this round, he will lose 5 points. This puts him at 31, but he's got an opportunity to pick up some more points, because now it's our tenure of office round, which is the entire time that a cabinet member served in a full-time capacity will be counted towards points. So even though he was acting as the head of other departments, it wasn't a full-time position. So we're only counting his time as Secretary of the Treasury, which was from October 6th, 1814 to October 21st, 1816, just over 2 years. So he gets 2 points here. And now we have our bonus point rounds, which is where cabinet members can earn a bonus point if they serve in more than one full-time cabinet position. He did not. He was just Secretary of the Treasury. A bonus point can be earned if the cabinet member served as a full-time cabinet member in more than one presidential administration. It was close. He was right at the end of the Madison administration, but he did not transition over when Monroe became president. He left before that, so he doesn't earn that one. And he does not earn that bonus point for becoming president. He did not make it to that point. So that leaves him with a grand total of 33 points, which puts him still, even taking away those points, he is still in a tie for third place of all of the Madison cabinet members we've ranked to date.
That's good, yeah.
Yeah.
Does he have a portrait?
He does have a portrait. Let's see.
If you listen to the show, that's my favorite.
That's Steve's favorite.
Well, and I decided with seat at the table, we don't take portraits into consideration, because it's like, most of the cabinet members are kind of behind the scenes, but we do with the vice presidency series, because they are potentially that public facing.
Yeah, he showed me a portrait of him. It's a good one. I'd give that a 5.
But we do have one more question to ask. Cody and Stephen, after all I've shared about Alexander Dallas's life and career and what we've discussed, do you think that this cabinet member is notable enough or impactful enough to earn a seat at the table of the Cabinet All-Stars?
There's no question in mind. He absolutely does.
No way. No. Yeah, absolutely he does. Yeah, 100%.
He's too important. And yeah, it's like he's one that he should be talked about more.
Yeah, he should be, like, when you mention like people that are prominence of our, our past, he should be there always.
Yeah.
And that was one of the things as I started researching the Madison presidency, Dallas's name kept popping up. And it was like, who is this guy? Why don't we know more about him? And then I started reading about him and it was like, this guy really should be. I think this is one of the largest cases that we've seen to date of somebody who is a forgotten figure who really shouldn't be. If not for him, the nation's finances were in a mess. He came up with the plan that helped to pull us back from the brink, to help in that transition back to peacetime, to get the nation's economic system back in order. So this guy deserves that seat. He, like we were talking about earlier, he didn't get positions just because he knew somebody or he was part of this family. He really earned them. He proved them. And so I agree. I think he has very well earned this seat at the table of the Cabinet All-Stars. And with that, we are at the end of our episode. Guys, thank y'all so much for being here. This has been a great opportunity to get to talk to y'all. I, of course, listen to you on a regular basis, but the interaction is one way. So it's nice to be able to talk with you and to share this, especially this one, he's an imperfect man, but not as imperfect as some of the folks that y'all have covered.
Yeah. There's some scum we've talked about.
Yeah. Well, thank you again for having us on your show. It was really, really insightful. Yeah.
There's not much. Usually, there's not much in history that I'll put it this way. There's not much I learned that I didn't know, and this is definitely an instance where I learned some things where I'm like, oh, I have no idea about this guy, not realizing his importance. Yeah. So I'm really glad to fill that gap.
Well, I'm always glad to help, and for our listeners, I hope you feel the same way. And as you're getting done with this episode, be sure, if you haven't already, check out Imperfect Men wherever you get your podcasts. I will have information on my social media around the release of this episode. But be sure to give it a listen. Thank y'all so much. Thank you to our listeners. And until next time, stay safe and healthy. Be kind to one another. And take care, dear friends.
Have you ever wondered why we call French fries, or why something is the greatest thing since sliced bread? There are answers to those questions. Everything Everywhere Daily is a podcast for curious people who want to learn more about the world around them. Every day, you'll learn something new about things you never knew you didn't know. Subjects include history, science, geography, mathematics, and culture. If you're a curious person and want to learn more about the world you live in, just subscribe to Everything Everywhere Daily wherever you cast your pod.